he was pronounced dead. The doctors, staring at the 37 bullet and shrapnel wounds that covered his body, zipped him into a body bag. But as they lifted the sack onto the stretcher, this man, who had already endured 6 hours of non-stop combat and overwhelming odds, found the strength for one last act of defiance. He lifted his head, looked the doctor in the eye, and spat directly into his face. They couldn't kill him. They couldn't break him. They could only send him back to finish the fight. This is the story of Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez, a warrior who redefined the very concept of human endurance. Before we jump into the frozen hell of the Special Forces, I want a roll call. This is a story about the warrior spirit, forged in the toughest places on Earth. Pause the video right now, go down to the comments, and tell me, what state and city are you from? Whether it was poverty, war, or injustice, let's honor the spirit of the fight in your own blood. Drop your story below, and let's get into the deep history. Roy Perez Benavidez was born in 1935 in a world that offered him no advantages. He was born into the kind of crushing poverty that the American dream conveniently ignores. His father was a sharecropper of Mexican descent. His mother was a Native American woman of the Yaqui tribe. From his birth, he was a member of 2 different marginalized groups in Texas, a state that viewed both with suspicion and disdain. The only language he spoke until he was a teenager was Spanish. His early life was a constant lesson in being an outsider, a lesson that would ironically prepare him for a life in the secretive world of special operations. The stability of his young life was shattered by a tragedy that was both sudden and absolute. At the age of 2, his father died from tuberculosis. 2 years later, his mother succumbed to the same disease. Roy and his younger brother were orphaned, left without a safety net in a hostile world. He was taken in by relatives, an uncle and his aunt, who were already barely surviving in the dusty fields of South Texas. His world became a relentless cycle of labor. School was a distant luxury. Survival was the only curriculum. From the age of 6, Roy was working the fields. He was picking cotton, toiling in the sugar beet farms of Colorado, and moving with the migrant workers across the vast, unforgiving landscape of the American West. His life was a grim travelogue of hard labor, poverty, and prejudice. He endured the low wages, the appalling living conditions, and the constant, crushing knowledge that no matter how hard he worked, the system was designed to keep him in the dust. This upbringing, however, forged an unbreakable core within him. He learned to endure pain, to ignore exhaustion, and to rely only on the strength of his own hands. This discipline, born out of necessity, would later become the foundation of his legendary military career. He faced the systemic prejudice of his time at every turn. In the segregated towns of Texas, he was often denied service or subjected to racial slurs. He was told he was not smart enough, not clean enough, not American enough. These early humiliations were scars on his soul, but they served as fuel. They solidified a desperate hunger for respect, a need to prove to himself and to the world that his inherent worth was not determined by his skin color or his last name. He carried a deep, burning patriotism, viewing the United States as a promise that he was determined to make the country keep. At the age of 15, desperate for a change and tired of the endless, grinding poverty of the migrant circuit, Roy dropped out of school. He worked a series of odd jobs, but felt the walls closing in. He needed a path out, a way to transform himself from an anonymous worker into someone who mattered. In 1955, at the age of 19, he found that path. He walked into an Army recruiting office and enlisted. The military, despite its institutional prejudices, was one of the few places in America where a man of color could find a stable job, 3 square meals a day, and a chance to prove his mettle. Roy was initially assigned to a standard infantry unit, but the quiet discipline he had acquired working the fields quickly set him apart. He was a natural soldier, tough, resilient, and utterly dedicated to his duty. He excelled in the basic challenges, but he wanted more. He wanted the ultimate test. In the early 1960s, the Army was quietly expanding its special forces, the Green Berets. The training was a gauntlet designed to break men. It was long, grueling, and required an intellectual and physical commitment far beyond the standard infantry. The Green Berets were the elite of the elite, the intellectual warriors of the Army. And the Army's ingrained prejudice whispered that a young man who had dropped out of school and spoke mostly Spanish was not officer material, let alone special forces material. Roy ignored the whispers. He volunteered for the training. He studied the field manuals relentlessly, forcing his mind to absorb the complex language and tactics that had once seemed impossible. He pushed his body to the limit, enduring the long marches, the lack of sleep, and the brutal physical challenges of the selection process. His sheer will to succeed, his desire to prove himself worthy, became his greatest asset. He earned his Green Beret, a quiet but profound personal victory over the poverty and prejudice of his past. His first assignment took him to Vietnam in 1965. The conflict was still escalating, the first major ground commitment of U.S. troops. Roy was a specialist, trained in infiltration and advisory roles. On a routine patrol in the jungles, his life and his career were nearly ended by a single catastrophic mistake. He stepped on a landmine. The explosion tore through his body. He was thrown into the air, landing in a heap of dirt and pain. The shrapnel shredded his right leg, causing massive, immediate damage. When the medics found him, they stabilized him and shipped him back to the United States. His life as a Special Forces soldier was over. He woke up in a hospital bed in Fort Sam Houston, Texas, his right leg immobilized, his back throbbing with excruciating pain. The doctors were grim. They told him the damage was severe. The prognosis was that he would never walk normally again. He would be medically discharged and would spend the rest of his life with a disability. For Roy, this was a fate worse than death. To be sent back to the dust of South Texas, a crippled veteran, a proof that the system had finally broken him. He refused to accept it. He had fought too hard to get to the sky, only to be chained back to the earth by an accident. The challenge he now faced was not against an enemy army, but against the absolute authority of the American medical establishment. The same iron will that drove him from the cotton fields to the jungles of Vietnam was about to be deployed against the paralyzing inertia of his own broken body. His long, agonizing journey back to the battlefield was about to begin. Roy Benavidez lay in the sterile, air-conditioned isolation of the Fort Sam Houston hospital ward, but his mind refused to surrender to the stillness. The doctors had delivered their verdict with clinical finality: severe nerve damage, back injury, permanent disability. His military career was over. He was to be discharged, a casualty of the escalating war, destined to spend his remaining years on a modest disability pension. For a man who had clawed his way out of poverty and prejudice with sheer physical force and dedication, this sentence was more agonizing than the shrapnel wounds that riddled his body. He was a warrior, and they were telling him to be a patient. He was a fighter, and they were telling him to accept defeat. The atmosphere in the hospital was one of enforced resignation. Many of the men around him, suffering from grievous wounds that often left them as amputees or paraplegics, were learning to accept their new, diminished reality. They were adapting to wheelchairs, to prosthetics, to a life of perpetual convalescence. The doctors and nurses, though dedicated, were trained to manage long-term care, not to encourage miracles. But for Roy, every day spent in that bed was a betrayal of the Green Beret he had earned. His inner dialogue was simple. He hadn't escaped the fields of Texas just to trade them for a hospital bed in San Antonio. His recovery was agonizingly slow. The shrapnel fragments remained embedded near his spine. The pain was constant and often overwhelming, requiring heavy medication. But the medication dulled his mind, and Roy needed his mind sharp. He began a quiet rebellion, refusing the painkillers, choosing to embrace the pain as a constant, brutal reminder of his mission. The pain was his new drill sergeant. He would lie in the darkness, clenching his fists, channeling the rage and the fear of his past into a singular, focused act of will. The most damning medical assessment was that he would never regain full use of his feet. They dangled lifelessly from his ankles, unresponsive to his mental commands. The doctor stated that the nerve pathways were too damaged. For weeks, Roy tried everything. He would stare at his toes, willing them to twitch. He would lie there, sweating, pouring every ounce of concentration into that single, impossible command. Nothing. The silence from his feet was the loudest failure of his life. But Roy Benavidez was not a man who accepted never. He had learned in the poverty of his youth that when the system tells you no, you find a way to make it say yes. One night, while the ward was quiet, he executed his plan. He dragged himself out of bed, his paralyzed legs flopping uselessly behind him, the immense effort causing black spots to swim in his vision. He ignored the burning pain in his back. He crawled across the cold linoleum floor to the window. He fixed his gaze on a distant post outside, a tiny, seemingly arbitrary landmark. And then he began to drag himself, hand over hand, toward that post. He wasn't walking. He was crawling, pulling his dead weight across the floor, the immense friction wearing sores into his knees and elbows. When the nurses found him, they were horrified. They tried to restrain him, to sedate him, to force him back into the safety of his bed. But Roy fought them with the same ferocity he would later show the enemy. He knew that the moment he accepted the bed was the moment he accepted defeat. He started a secret, personalized rehabilitation program that violated every hospital rule. He used his bedposts, his chair, the walls, anything to lever his body upright. He would spend hours trying to force his feet to bear weight, collapsing repeatedly in exhaustion. The nurses, unable to stop him, and witnessing the sheer, terrifying force of his dedication, began to give up the fight. Some, seeing the fire in his eyes, even began to offer quiet, unofficial encouragement. One afternoon, during one of his agonizing struggles to stand, he heard one of the other patients, a bitter, severely wounded man, call out, "Why don't you just give it up, Benavidez? You'll never walk again." The words struck Roy like a punch, but instead of retreating, they ignited the final spark of defiance he needed. He poured all his rage, all his pain, all his life into the simple command, "Move." And then a tiny, almost imperceptible thing happened. His big toe twitched. It was a flicker, a small, involuntary spasm of nerve response. But to Roy, it was the sound of 1,000 church bells ringing. It was proof. The nerve pathways weren't dead. They were merely sleeping. He had won the first battle. He was not broken. He would walk again. From that moment on, his recovery accelerated, driven by a renewed, almost fanatical hope. He used crutches, then braces, pushing his body to the absolute limit every single day. He spent his free hours in the physical therapy pool, teaching his legs how to move again, fighting the water's resistance. The doctors, astonished by his progress, revised their prognosis. The damage was still severe, but the recovery was a medical anomaly. They could not explain it other than as a triumph of psychological will over physical reality. Within a year, Roy Benavidez was discharged, not with a disability pension, but with a full, official return to active duty. He walked out of the hospital, his gait stiff, his back a constant source of pain, but he walked under his own power. He had rejected the fate the system had written for him. he immediately volunteered for a second tour in Vietnam. The decision was met with confusion and awe by his comrades. He was a wounded veteran who had miraculously recovered. He had earned the right to stay home, safe and honored. But Roy knew he had to go back. The war that had broken his body had also defined his soul. He had to prove not only that he could walk, but that he could still fight. He had to prove that the sacrifice of his pain was worth the risk of his life. He knew what was waiting for him: the suffocating heat of the jungle, the constant threat of the unseen enemy, the high probability that his body, already weakened by injury, would fail him at a critical moment. But he was a Green Beret. He was a survivor, and he had a purpose. He would not just be a soldier in Vietnam. He would be a living monument to the power of the human will. He stepped onto the plane, heading toward the sound of the guns. The man who had cheated death once, now daring it to try again. He was ready to face the full, terrifying reality of the war, armed with nothing more than his repaired body and his unbreakable spirit. The true test of his strength was about to begin. Roy Benavidez arrived for his second tour in Vietnam in 1968, a living ghost of his former self. The scars were not just on his body, but in the official records. He had beaten the prognosis, defied the medical establishment, and forced his way back into the theater of war. But the men he served with knew his history. He was a legend before he even stepped into the jungle, the man who spat in the face of death and walked away. This reputation, however, was a double-edged sword. It earned him respect, but it also placed an impossible burden on his shoulders. He was viewed as unbreakable, and the Army was about to test that assumption to its absolute limit. He was assigned to the 5th Special Forces Group, stationed near Loc Ninh, a remote outpost close to the Cambodian border. This was the Iron Triangle, a desolate, heavily contested region that served as a primary transit point for Viet Cong, VC, and North Vietnamese Army, NVA troops traveling the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The environment was suffocating. Triple canopy jungle that choked out the sun, swamps teeming with disease, and an unseen enemy that moved with spectral efficiency. Roy's role was that of a Special Forces advisor and observer, a task requiring extreme subtlety, patience, and lethal efficiency. His days were a relentless cycle of intelligence gathering, reconnaissance patrols, and advisory missions to local South Vietnamese forces. His experience from his first tour, combined with the discipline learned during his recovery, made him a master of the jungle. He moved with a quiet competence, reading the subtle signs of enemy movement. A broken twig, a misplaced leaf, the absence of bird calls in a specific area. He was the human sensor, the early warning system for his unit. His physical state, however, was a daily confrontation with pain. His back, still riddled with shrapnel, was a constant, throbbing reminder of the landmine. The long, agonizing marches under the oppressive tropical heat, carrying a heavy rucksack, put his recovered leg and spine under continuous strain. He refused to show it. In the jungle, weakness is a luxury no one can afford. He would grind his teeth, focus on the task, and channel the pain into a cold, professional alertness. The young soldiers around him, black, white, and Latin, looked to him not just for guidance, but for an example of what was possible when the body failed and the spirit refused to quit. The nature of the war was changing. The NVA and VC were growing bolder, moving in larger numbers, and establishing permanent base camps just across the poorly defined border in Cambodia. The missions became riskier, pushing the Green Berets further and further into what was essentially enemy territory. The patrols were less about observing and more about direct, violent confrontation. Roy Benavidez excelled in these high-stakes encounters. His movements were fluid, his reactions instantaneous, and his command presence under fire was absolute. He was a natural leader in the chaos of combat, able to make complex tactical decisions while under a storm of incoming fire. The men of his company, seeing the way he moved and fought, knew they were serving with a man who viewed death not as an end, but as an inconvenience he had already overcome once. The unit's primary job became the insertion of small, highly sensitive intelligence teams into contested zones. These teams, often local Nungs, highly valued for their jungle skills, led by a single Green Beret officer, were sent to gather crucial intelligence on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They were the tip of the spear, the human tripwires who provided the strategic picture for the entire region. The danger was immense. If these teams were compromised, they were trapped, miles from friendly lines, surrounded by a hostile jungle, and facing an enemy that would show no mercy. The months leading up to May 1968 were a period of escalating dread. Intelligence suggested a massive buildup of NVA forces. The sense of foreboding hung heavy over the camp. The patrols were finding more sophisticated bunkers, larger enemy movements, and better armed enemy soldiers. Everyone knew a major confrontation was coming. On the morning of May 13, 1968, the air was thick, hot, and oppressively still. Roy Benavidez was resting near the command post after returning from a grueling multi-day patrol. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. The radio crackled to life, spewing static and a desperate fragmented voice. It was a call from one of their 6-man intelligence teams operating deep in Cambodia, a team code named Pony 4. The voice was thin, raw with terror, and barely comprehensible. "We are compromised. We are under heavy attack. We are taking massive casualties. Need immediate extraction. We are surrounded. Repeat, surrounded." The radio then went dead, replaced by a blast of static. The command post immediately scrambled. They knew the location of the team, a small clearing deep in the jungle, one of the most hostile regions imaginable. The 6 men were cut off, their position revealed, facing what was likely an entire NVA company. The situation was not just critical, it was a confirmed slaughter. A rescue helicopter, a Huey, was immediately dispatched. Roy Benavidez watched it lift off, his heart hammering in his chest. He knew the odds. A single chopper flying into a compromised hot zone was a clay pigeon. He stood at the edge of the landing zone, waiting for word, the tension a physical vice around his chest. Minutes later, the radio returned the grim verdict. The Huey had reached the area but couldn't land. The jungle clearing was a killing field. The pilot reported intense fire from 3 sides, and the clearing was so small that the downwash from the rotors was exposing the trapped men. The chopper itself was taking hits. The pilot aborted the landing, pulled up, and began to circle, unable to provide help. Then, the second, more chilling transmission came. The Huey had been shot down a short distance away, forced to crash land due to damage. The situation had spiraled from a rescue mission to a double disaster. Now, there were not 6 men trapped, but 9, and a downed helicopter pilot and crew to worry about. Roy Benavidez didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for orders. The man who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death knew that his time had come. He ran to the loading area. He grabbed his M16 rifle, a standard-issue pistol, and a medic bag, the essentials. He knew he was the last option. His back screamed in protest from the sudden exertion. His lungs burned, but the pain was irrelevant. He had spent years fighting his body to get back to this very moment. He had to prove he could still fight. He had to honor the sacrifice of his recovery. He ran to the next available extraction helicopter, a Huey piloted by Major Larry Raymer. Roy didn't ask. He demanded. He jumped aboard. He was no longer a Special Forces advisor. He was a one-man rescue mission. He was Roy Benavidez, the man who had cheated death once, now betting his life that he could do it again. As the Huey lifted off, heading into the wall of green that marked the enemy's territory, Roy knew he was flying into a confirmed slaughterhouse, but he had a promise to keep to the young men trapped below. A promise written in the blood he had shed years earlier on a faraway minefield. Major Larry Raymer's Huey hovered low over the jungle clearing, the downdraft from its rotors whipping the foliage into a frenzy. The scene below was absolute chaos. The clearing, barely large enough for the Huey to land, was being hammered by enemy fire. The pilot, aware of the fate of the previous chopper, dropped to a height of 10 feet and refused to descend further. He was buying Roy Benavidez a split-second chance to jump. Roy didn't wait for permission. He didn't even use the skid. He threw his medic bag and M16 out the door, took a breath, and leaped from the hovering helicopter. He hit the ground hard, the immense impact jarring his already injured spine, momentarily stunning him. But the adrenaline surged, overriding the pain. He rolled, grabbed his rifle, and immediately plunged into the hellish reality of the hot zone. The enemy fire was so dense it sounded less like individual shots, and more like a continuous, roaring zipper tearing through the air. The trapped six-man team, codenamed Pony 4, was pinned down near the shattered wreckage of their own communications equipment, their position completely compromised. Roy's first objective was not the NVA, it was the 9 men he had to save. He sprinted toward the perimeter, a man running into a machine gun. Within seconds, the ground around him erupted. The enemy, spotting the new arrival, shifted their focus. Roy felt the first punch of lead. A rifle round tore through his right leg, causing him to stumble, but not fall. The second hit him an instant later. A round glanced off the back of his head, stunning him, opening a jagged wound that immediately began to pour blood down his face, obscuring his vision. He reached the perimeter of the pinned down unit, dropping into a shallow depression behind a mound of earth. The scene was grim. 3 men were clearly dead, their bodies riddled with bullet holes. The other 3 were wounded, low on ammunition, and fighting a desperate last-stand defense. They looked up at Roy, the man who had materialized from the sky, with the desperate hope of men who had given up on rescue. Roy immediately assessed the situation with the cold logic of a Green Beret. Defense was useless. They were surrounded. They needed to move. He ordered the 3 remaining able-bodied men to focus their fire on the enemy positions he pointed out, laying down a base of fire to cover his next move. Ignoring the blood streaming into his eyes and the searing pain in his leg, Roy launched himself into the open, a target of opportunity for the NVA. His mission was to retrieve the critically needed secret documents, the operational codes and intelligence logs that could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. He crawled to the dead team leader, pulling the crucial documents from the man's vest. As he was pulling back, a burst of AK-47 fire ripped through his arm and his side. The impact knocked him backward, but he held onto the codes. He had acquired the documents, but his left arm was now useless, hanging limply at his side, and the wound in his abdomen was bleeding profusely. His communication was hampered by the blood and his failing strength, but his mind was clear. The rescue Huey had to know the ground was too hot. He scrambled to retrieve the team's radio, but it was shattered. He found a smoke grenade, the only signal he had left. He managed to pull the pin with his teeth and his one good hand, sending a plume of red smoke into the air, signaling the surviving Huey pilot, Major Raymer, that the extraction was needed now, regardless of the cost. Now came the most brutal phase of the 6-hour ordeal, moving the wounded. Roy was operating with one arm, a shattered leg, and a bleeding head and torso. He moved methodically, like a broken machine refusing to stop. He used his good leg to drag the wounded men, one by one, to the central point in the clearing. He carried the heaviest man, throwing him over his good shoulder, the immense weight straining his already damaged spine, the effort causing him to black out momentarily. He was shot again, a bullet ripping through his foot, but he kept moving. He used his teeth to tie bandages. He ignored the blood pooling in the mud around him. The enemy fire intensified. The NVA commanders knew the Americans were trying to extract intelligence and personnel, and they poured every available asset into the clearing. Mortar rounds began walking toward the position, throwing huge plumes of mud and shrapnel into the air. Roy dragged the last of the living wounded to the center, then turned his attention to the dead. He refused to leave the bodies of his fallen comrades. It was a matter of honor, a non-negotiable principle of the Special Forces Code. He managed to drag 2 of the dead, struggling against the rigor mortis and the sheer weight of the corpses, placing them with the survivors. He had performed the impossible. He had reached the team, secured the intelligence, treated the wounded, and retrieved the fallen. But he was now a bleeding, staggering wreck, surrounded by the enemy, with no working radio, no cover, and no hope of air support. He was a beacon of defiance in the middle of a confirmed slaughter. He looked up at the circling Huey. Major Raymer, incredibly, was still up there, dodging the flak, and screamed a silent message with the force of his presence. "We need out. Now." The pilot, recognizing the red smoke and the desperate reality of the scene, knew there was no other choice. He dove the Huey back into the clearing, ignoring the fusillade of fire. Roy, using the last of his strength, directed the able-bodied survivors to drag the wounded and the dead toward the hovering helicopter. As the last survivor was pulled aboard, Roy, shot in nearly every major part of his body and bleeding out, was the only man left on the ground. He turned, laid down a final, desperate burst of covering fire with his M16, and then lunged toward the helicopter skid, the ground around him exploding with incoming fire. He had survived the first phase, but the final, brutal confrontation with the enemy was about to happen on the very step of his escape. Roy Benavidez grasped the helicopter skid with the last reserves of strength in his good hand. His body was a ruin. His left arm was useless. His right leg was numb, and blood soaked his uniform from wounds in his head, torso, and foot. He was hauling himself onto the skid, the roaring wash of the rotors pushing him and the wounded men back, when the enemy launched their final, desperate counterattack. A North Vietnamese soldier, emerging from the tree line that bordered the clearing, leaped onto the helicopter skid opposite Roy. He was a man fueled by desperation and ideological fervor, wielding a razor-sharp bayonet mounted on his rifle. The NVA soldier and Roy were face to face, locked in a duel that lasted only seconds but contained a lifetime of brutal violence. The soldier lunged with the bayonet, aiming for Roy's chest. Roy, operating on pure survival instinct, threw his body sideways, the movement excruciating, and the bayonet sliced deep into his already wounded left arm. The pain was blinding, but it bought him a moment. The NVA soldier pulled the bayonet free and lunged again, this time aiming for Roy's throat. Roy parried the strike with the butt of his M16, the force of the block snapping his rifle and sending it tumbling into the jungle below. They were now locked in a primal hand-to-hand struggle on the narrow skid. Roy, unable to rely on his arms, used his shoulder and his massive chest, slamming his body into the thinner NVA soldier. The enemy soldier, realizing he couldn't push Roy off, brought the bayonet down in a swift, vicious arc. It pierced Roy's back, then again, and a third time. Roy gasped, the air knocked from his lungs, his body collapsing. But as he fell, he managed to grab the NVA soldier's rifle. With the immense, final surge of his dying strength, Roy twisted the rifle, using its own weight as a lever, and brought the butt of the weapon smashing down onto the North Vietnamese soldier's head. The force of the blow was sickening and conclusive. The enemy soldier crumpled, falling backward off the skid and disappearing into the dense foliage below. Roy had won the duel, but the victory was a full-body system failure. He was shot in the head. His arm was nearly useless. His side was bleeding from the earlier bullet wound, and he now had 7 new, deep bayonet wounds in his back and shoulders. He was a shredded mass of muscle, bone, and blood. The crew chief, seeing the bayonet wounds and the collapsing body, grabbed Roy's collar and hauled him unceremoniously into the belly of the Huey. He landed in a heap of the wounded and the dead, his consciousness flickering like a faulty circuit. The cabin was a scene of chaos and triage, the wounded screaming, the medics working frantically, and the pilots pulling the chopper up into the sky, dodging the final wave of enemy fire. As they flew back toward the base camp at Loch Ninh, the severity of Roy's injuries became brutally clear. He was bleeding from too many places to count. He had lost an unimaginable amount of blood. He lay still, his breathing shallow, his pulse a faint flutter. He was placed among the soldiers who had not survived the extraction. The medic, after a quick, desperate examination, delivered the final, chilling verdict. No pulse, no respiration. He had fought for 6 hours to save his brothers, and in the final moments of escape, his body had given out. Roy Benavidez was officially pronounced dead on arrival at the forward aid station. He was zipped into a large, olive-drab body bag and placed on the tarmac with the other fallen. The world had gone dark. He had left his body behind. The immense spirit that had dragged him from the fields of Texas to the mountains of Vietnam was, for all intents and purposes, gone. His 6-hour mission was over. His legendary life had concluded. The finality of the body bag was the last act of a story of unparalleled heroism. But the story of Roy Benavidez was never one for simple conclusions. He was not a man who accepted a verdict written by doctors or generals. He had already refused to die in a minefield. He had refused to accept the word of medical science. He was not about to accept a diagnosis delivered by a trauma medic. As the doctors began the grim process of identifying the dead, a senior physician approached the body bags. He bent over Roy's bag, the rubberized canvas cold and heavy. He was about to attach the toe tag, the final bureaucratic documentation of death, when he noticed something. A flicker, a sound, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement that defies the stillness of death. The doctor, leaning in close, saw a faint, almost invisible spasm in Roy's chest. He heard a shallow, barely audible intake of breath. He quickly unzipped the bag and stared into the battered, bloody face of the man who had been declared dead. Roy's eyes were closed, his body still and cold. The doctor placed his stethoscope on Roy's chest, finding only the faintest whisper of a heartbeat. He touched the nose, cold and clammy. He shook the body, receiving no response. The diagnosis of death was holding up. Then the doctor did the final, necessary check. He leaned close to Roy's face, pulling the eyelids back, confirming pupil dilation, the final signal of life's cessation. As he did this, the immense, unyielding spirit of Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez, which had been lurking in the deepest corner of his shattered body, surfaced for one last, single, spectacular act of defiance. Roy Benavidez, the man who had been pronounced dead, the man who was in a body bag, gathered the last bit of energy he possessed, tilted his head, and with the immense, final will that had driven his entire life, he spat directly into the doctor's face. It was not a sign of consciousness, not a rational act. It was a reflex. It was a raw, primal rejection of the world's final attempt to contain him. It was a statement. I am not dead yet. The doctor, stunned, wiped his face, but his shock was instantly replaced by a surge of adrenaline and awe. He screamed at the medics. Get this man to the operating table. He's alive. He's fighting. The body bag was torn open. Roy Benavidez, riddled with 37 wounds, 7 of which were bayonet cuts, a ruptured abdomen, and a near-shattered spine, was rushed into emergency surgery. His 6-hour mission had ended in a body bag, But his war was far from over. He had survived the enemy, the fire, the jungle, and the exhaustion. Now he faced the final, complex battle against his own overwhelming trauma, in the bureaucratic process that was determined to classify his heroism as a lost cause. The spat was a declaration of war against the administrative convenience of death. Roy Benavidez, the man who refused to stay in the body bag, was immediately wheeled into a field operating room, a battlefield of fluorescent lights and blood-soaked metal. For the next several weeks, he endured a relentless cycle of surgeries. The complexity of his injuries was staggering. 37 separate wounds, including a ruptured stomach, major damage to the soft tissue of his arms and legs, and the 7 bayonet punctures to his back and shoulder. His jaw was broken. His lungs were compromised. His left eye was severely damaged. He had survived the NVA ambush only to enter a protracted battle with infection, pain, and the overwhelming statistical probability that he should not be alive. His recovery was a slow-motion replay of his fight after the landmine injury, but exponentially more brutal. He was flown from Loc Ninh to hospitals in South Vietnam, then to the massive military medical facility in Clark Air Base in the Philippines, and finally back to the United States. He was in and out of consciousness for months, his mind drifting in a fog of fever and surgical anesthesia. When he was lucid, the pain was a constant, physical scream. During this time, the true extent of the damage became clear. The wounds had taken a devastating toll. He lost all his teeth due to infection and trauma. His vision was permanently impaired. Damage to his nerves meant he had limited feeling in his limbs for months. His throat was so damaged from the continuous use of tubes and the trauma of the bayonet fight that he was unable to speak for an extended period. His communication was reduced to writing notes on a pad. Simple requests filtered through the overwhelming reality of his injuries. The doctors, still amazed he was alive, maintained their grim realism. He would likely never regain full function of his hands. He would certainly never return to combat, and he would face a lifetime of chronic pain. But the bureaucracy, the paper enemy, was already closing in. While Roy was fighting for his life, the military machine began the process of documenting his heroism. The men he had saved, the Special Forces members, and the downed Huey crew all provided harrowing, detailed testimony about the 6 hours of combat. They described his impossible feats, running into the ambush unarmed, securing the documents under intense fire, carrying the wounded one by one, and the final, savage, hand-to-hand fight. The recommendations were swift. The Medal of Honor. The Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration the United States can bestow, reserved for acts of conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. Roy's actions clearly qualified. But in the chaos of the immediate aftermath of the battle and the near-death status of Roy, critical paperwork was lost. The official on-site commendation that details the final moments of action was somehow lost in the transfer of forces and the rapid movement of the casualties. This loss initiated a 12-year war of attrition against the Army itself. Because the initial, mandatory documentation was missing, the Medal of Honor recommendation was downgraded. It was replaced with the Distinguished Service Cross, DSC, the second highest award. A DSC is an immense honor, but for Roy, it felt like another institutional failure. He had done more than anyone thought humanly possible, and the system was telling him that his proof was insufficient. Roy's struggle to correct the record was excruciating. He was fighting his own body while fighting the Army's archives. His speech slowly returned, but his voice was permanently damaged, often weak and raspy. He spent his time dictating letters, signing forms, and trying to track down the men he had saved, the only witnesses who could validate his claim. The military, in a classic display of institutional inertia, kept repeating the same line: insufficient documentation. He had to prove his heroism all over again, not in the jungle, but in committee rooms and through legal channels. The irony was palpable. The enemy couldn't kill him, but the paperwork was succeeding in erasing his most profound achievement. He retired from the Army in 1976, broken in body, but not in spirit. He dedicated his retirement years to a personal crusade to complete the record. He traveled across the country, tracking down the men of Pony 4 and the Rescue Huey crew. He gathered new affidavits, new sworn testimonies from the men whose lives he had saved. These men, who owed him everything, willingly, and sometimes tearfully, provided the missing pieces of the puzzle. They described the scene on the skid, the look in his eyes, the 7 separate bayonet wounds that marked his final stand. The evidence was finally compiled, a massive, unassailable dossier of undeniable heroism. But even then, the process was slow. It took the intervention of politicians and former military leaders, ashamed of the Army's failure, to finally push the case through the labyrinthine channels of the Pentagon. The lost paperwork, the official indifference, and the long wait did not break him. Instead, they added a layer of profound, painful dignity to his story. He had refused to be a victim of the mine. He refused to be a victim of the bayonet. And he refused to be a victim of the bureaucracy. He treated his fight for the Medal of Honor with the same lethal focus he treated a 6-hour gunfight, a mission that had to be completed regardless of the cost. The man who had been riddled with 37 wounds was fighting his 38th, the wound of institutional amnesia, and he was determined to win. The war against the paperwork enemy finally ended on February 24th, 1981, 12 long years after the mission and 5 years after Roy Benavidez had retired from the Army. The setting was the East Room of the White House, a space of controlled elegance and historical gravity that stood in stark contrast to the mud and chaos of the Cambodian clearing. The moment was the culmination of a 13-year odyssey of pain, perseverance, and bureaucratic resistance. Roy Benavidez, now 46 years old, stood before the assembly. He was a man physically transformed by his experience. His body, though upright, bore the invisible burden of 37 wounds and a spine fused by shrapnel. He wore his dress uniform, the Distinguished Service Cross already pinned to his chest, but his face was that of a weary, humble warrior. He was surrounded by his wife, his children, and the handful of men he had saved, including the former members of Pony 4 and the Rescue Huey crew, the living witnesses to his impossible heroism. The atmosphere was thick with the weight of time and the emotional release of decades of denied justice. President Ronald Reagan, known for his ability to capture the American spirit, stepped to the podium. His speech was a powerful, concise narrative of the 6 hours of hell that had transpired on May 2nd, 1968. He recounted the jump from the 10-foot hover, the retrieval of the documents, the continuous stream of wounds, bullet after bullet, shrapnel after shrapnel. But the moment the president focused on was the final, brutal confrontation, the hand-to-hand fight on the helicopter skid. Reagan recounted how Roy, already a bleeding ruin, fought the NVA soldier with pure, animal desperation. He described the bayonet wounds, the broken rifle, and the final successful counterblow. The president paused, his voice dropping for emphasis, and then delivered the line that stunned the room into absolute silence. His internal injuries were so severe that he was given up for dead, and in the morgue, he spat in the face of the doctor to let him know he was still alive. This single raw detail, the act of defiance in the body bag, brought the enormity of Roy's struggle into clear, visceral focus. It was a detail the Army had tried to suppress for years, but which President Reagan elevated as the ultimate testament to the unbreakable American spirit. It was the moment the bureaucracy's lie was finally and publicly destroyed. The president continued, speaking directly to Roy Benavidez. If the story of his heroism were a movie script, the critics would call it unbelievable. He stressed that Roy had done what no one in his right mind would do. He had placed his life, a life already miraculously saved, on the line, not once, but continuously, for 6 hours, in an act of devotion to his comrades. Finally, President Reagan performed the act that Roy had waited 13 years for. He took the Congressional Medal of Honor, a star of gold and bronze, and draped it around the neck of the former migrant worker, the boy who had defied the landmine and the doctors. The medal settled over the collar of his uniform, a permanent shining validation of every painful step, every sleepless night, and every denied request for documentation. The moment was a triumph, but for Roy Benavidez, it was a release. He stood rigidly at attention, his face showing a lifetime of discipline, but his eyes were filled with tears. Tears of pain, tears of gratitude, and tears of final, total vindication. The Medal of Honor was not a reward. It was an acknowledgement. It was the country finally, publicly, keeping its promise. The emotional climax continued as Roy embraced the men he had saved, the witnesses who had fought their own 13-year battle against the bureaucracy to ensure his story was told. Their presence was a powerful counter-salute to the president's formality, a recognition of the brotherhood that transcended the ceremony. The Medal of Honor was given by the president, but it was earned alongside the men of Pony 4. The ceremony had a profound impact on the nation. It was a story of heroism that cut across racial, economic, and political lines. The migrant worker, the uneducated farmhand, had achieved the highest military honor in the land. It was a validation of the core American promise, that courage and merit, not privilege or birthright, are the true measures of a man. For the Latino community, for the Vietnam veterans who had returned to a country that often scorned them, and for the young men and women still facing barriers, Roy Benavidez became a giant. The victory, however, was bittersweet. Roy's physical struggles would continue for the rest of his life. The man who was too tough to die would spend his remaining years fighting chronic pain, the lingering effects of the shrapnel, and the deep emotional trauma of the 6-hour battle. But he had the Medal of Honor, and with it, he gained a powerful, new platform. He dedicated the rest of his life not to rest, but to a different kind of service. He became a public speaker, traveling the country, sharing his story with millions of young people. His message was simple, direct, and powerful, delivered with a raspy voice, damaged by the bayonet wounds. The true meaning of the Medal of Honor is never to give up. He didn't speak about fighting foreign enemies. He spoke about fighting drug addiction, poverty, and despair. He spoke about the importance of family, faith, and the Constitution. Roy Benavidez transformed the ultimate military award into a moral compass for civilian life. He ensured that the heroism of May 2nd, 1968 was not just a chapter in a war book, but a timeless lesson in the sheer, indomitable power of the human will. The former migrant worker who spat in the face of death had finally won his final, enduring war. The war for recognition, respect, and eternal meaning. He had proven that his spirit was indeed stronger than his body. The Medal of Honor ceremony in 1981 was not Roy Benavidez's retirement. It was his mobilization for a new, permanent theater of operations, the battle for the American spirit. He had finally won the validation he sought, and he immediately used that platform not for personal gain, but for service. For the next 17 years, until his death, he became one of the nation's most sought-after motivational speakers, turning his traumatic history into a powerful message of hope and resilience. His audience was vast and diverse: schools in inner cities and remote rural towns, corporate boardrooms, military bases, and veterans' hospitals. He stood before audiences, a man whose physical presence was a living monument to human trauma. and he spoke with a voice permanently raspy from the bayonet wounds he had survived. He never used notes. He simply told his story, starting with the cotton fields and ending with the body bag, always raw, always honest. His message was a direct challenge to the culture of complaint and surrender. He didn't preach political doctrine. He preached a doctrine of personal responsibility and unbreakable will. He would tell young people, many of whom were fighting their own battles with poverty, drugs, or family trauma, the true meaning of the Medal of Honor is never to give up. He used his own story as a surgical tool, carving away excuses and leaving only the stark reality of choice. He would often end his talks by asking audiences to look closely at his face, saying, "I have 37 holes in my body. Don't tell me what you can't do. Tell me what you will do." For the Latino community, Roy Benavidez became a giant, a symbol of what could be achieved despite the crushing weight of prejudice. His image, often shown in uniform with the Medal of Honor around his neck, became an icon of pride and possibility. He validated their struggle, proving that their loyalty was not passive, but was forged in the heat of battle. He became an irrefutable argument against the stereotypes that had plagued his people for centuries. He showed that the migrant worker was not just fit for the fields. He was fit for the highest honors the nation could bestow. His heritage, once a source of humiliation in his youth, was transformed into a national source of pride. He maintained a profound connection to the Special Forces community, serving as a powerful link between the legendary era of Vietnam and the modern counter-terrorism forces. The Green Berets saw him not just as a veteran, but as a mythical ancestor, a man whose actions set the bar for the entire regiment. His life was a testament to the core Green Beret ethos: to be self-reliant, to thrive in the face of impossible odds, and to prioritize the mission and the men above self. However, the war continued to extract its price. Despite his outward strength, Roy's health was a constant, debilitating battle. The shrapnel near his spine and the lingering nerve damage caused chronic, agonizing pain. He underwent multiple surgeries throughout the 1980s and 90s, attempts to alleviate the constant suffering that defined his daily existence. He developed diabetes, which complicated his other conditions. The man who had been too tough to die found himself slowly being worn down by the cumulative damage of his 6 hours of hell. His emotional healing was just as complex. He never fully escaped the trauma of May 2nd, 1968. He was a veteran of the war, and his experiences, like those of millions of his peers, were not easily processed. He found solace in his family, in his faith, and in his tireless work as a speaker. But the psychological wounds, the flashbacks, the nightmares, the sense of hypervigilance were permanent scars. He used his work as a form of therapy, transforming his painful memories into a public service, teaching others how to manage the darkness he carried. The relationship with the men he saved remained central to his life. The bonds forged in that clearing with the former Pony 4 team members and the crew of the Rescue Huey were unbreakable. They held annual reunions, a quiet, solemn acknowledgement of the profound debt they shared. Their collective existence was a mutual validation of their sacrifice, a brotherhood that stood outside the formality of the military. As the 1990s progressed, Roy's health deteriorated rapidly. The constant travel and the demands of his motivational speaking schedule became physically unsustainable. His voice, once his most powerful weapon on the stage, grew weaker, sometimes failing him entirely. He was often speaking in pain, powered by sheer will. His final battle was fought in the hospital room, a stark parallel to his agonizing recovery decades earlier. He was admitted to the Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, the same facility where he had fought his way out of the paralyzed state after the landmine injury. On November 29, 1998, at the age of 63, his heart finally failed. The man who had cheated death with a spit on the tarmac, who had survived 37 wounds, finally accepted the final, inevitable muster. The outpouring of grief was national. Roy Benavidez was buried with full military honors at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery. His pallbearers included the men he had saved. The young migrant worker who had run away from poverty had returned to rest as one of the most decorated and revered figures in American military history. The legacy of Roy Benavidez is not merely the Medal of Honor, but the powerful proof that the greatest force in any war or any life is the spiritual force of determination. He gave America a simple, powerful narrative of self-creation. A man can define his own worth, transcend his circumstances, and achieve greatness in the face of absolute, institutional resistance. His life remains a permanent, shining challenge to every person who believes they are too poor, too uneducated, or too broken to achieve their dreams. Roy Benavidez, the man who refused to stay dead, left us with a legacy that is truly immortal. Roy Benavidez's death in 1998 was not an end. It was a final, permanent transition into the national pantheon of heroes. The true measure of his legacy is found not in the trauma he survived, but in the enduring way his story continues to shape institutions and inspire generations. His physical presence faded, but the force of his example only grew, cemented into the very infrastructure of the military he had fought so hard to rejoin. The most prominent and enduring tribute to his service sails the oceans of the world, the USNS Benavidez, TAKR 306. Commissioned in 2001, this massive vehicle cargo ship is one of the pillars of the U.S. Navy's Military Sealift Command. A warship bearing the name of the former migrant worker patrols the globe, a silent, powerful reminder that the Navy's honor is inextricably linked to the service of men like him. Thousands of sailors and civilians serve aboard her, and every man and woman who walks that deck is walking under the banner of the man who spat in the face of death. The ship is a physical monument to the concept that true American strength is found in diversity and courage. Beyond the oceans, his name graces buildings and institutions across the nation. The Roy P. Benavidez Special Operations Museum at Fort Sam Houston preserves his artifacts and recounts the 6-hour battle. Schools, post offices, and streets bear his name, ensuring that the legacy of the Green Beret is woven into the fabric of daily American life, particularly in his home state of Texas and among the Latino and veteran communities. These memorials are not merely plaques. They are public declarations that the once unwanted boy from the fields is now essential to the American identity. His impact on the culture of the U.S. Army Special Forces is absolute. The Green Berets hold his story as a foundational text. The 6-hour battle is studied not just as a mission of valor, but as a lesson in unconventional leadership and decentralized command under maximum duress. His ability to prioritize the mission, retrieving the documents, even while his body was failing, and his willingness to sacrifice himself entirely for his men serve as the non-negotiable standard for every aspiring Special Forces soldier. He is the living embodiment of the Special Forces creed, de oppresso liber, to free the oppressed. The enduring power of his story lies in its core lessons, often encapsulated in the quotes he left behind, delivered from a body that was proof of the word's truth. Lesson 1. The Power of the Will. Roy's most famous and repeated line was, "The true meaning of the Medal of Honor is never to give up." Meaning today, this quote transcends military service. It is a universal manifesto for resilience. It is a direct rebuke to the culture of entitlement, reminding all who hear it that success is earned through continuous, painful effort. When he spoke this line to students, he was not talking about fighting the NVA. He was talking about fighting the temptation to quit on homework, fighting drug addiction, and fighting the self-doubt imposed by society. His very existence, The fact that he walked and spoke after the mine injury gave this simple phrase the weight of absolute, unassailable truth. It is the motto for the unconquerable spirit. Lesson 2. The Soldier's Code. A lesser-known, but equally powerful quote emerged from his 6 hours of combat. I didn't care how many enemy soldiers were out there. I knew my outfit was in trouble, and I knew I had to go. Meaning today. This is the ultimate expression of the unit over self ethos. It speaks directly to the concept of moral imperative. His decision was not based on a probability calculation. It was based on an unthinking, instantaneous commitment to his brothers. In a modern context, this quote champions the necessity of placing communal obligation, whether to family, team, or community, above personal safety or convenience. It is the core lesson of true leadership and loyalty. Lesson 3. The Price of Freedom. In his public speeches, he often delivered a direct challenge to the nation. I have 37 holes in my body. Don't tell me what you can't do. Tell me what you will do. Meaning today. This quote is his final act of defiance against the prejudice of his youth and the skepticism of his time. It is a demand for excellence and a rejection of excuses. By quantifying his sacrifice, 37 holes, he gained the moral authority to challenge the apathy of the public. He turned his wounds into an educational tool, forcing the listener to confront their own potential and lethargy. It is the most powerful piece of emotional leverage any hero has ever given to the American public. The legacy of Roy Benavidez is a continuous, living narrative of inspiration. It is found in the young Latino student who sees the USNS Benavidez and realizes the Navy is a path for him. It is found in the veteran struggling with PTSD who remembers that his hero also battled the constant pain and never surrendered. It is found in the thousands of Green Berets who strive to uphold the standard he set on that desolate clearing in Cambodia. Roy Benavidez was a product of the harshest realities of American life, yet he rose to achieve its highest ideals. His journey from the dust of the cotton fields to the White House Rose Garden is not just a military record. It is a profound American manifesto. His life is a permanent, shining answer to the skepticism of the bigots and the apathy of the indifferent. He refused to be a victim. He refused to be forgotten. And he ensured that the story of the 6 hours he spent in hell would forever remain an eternal, indomitable monument to the power of the human heart. We began this story with the impossible, a man pronounced dead, riddled with 37 wounds, defying the finality of the body bag with a single furious act. We traveled from the cotton fields of the segregated South to the frozen air of the Chosin Reservoir, and from the agonizing quiet of a hospital bed to the formal dignity of the White House Rose Garden. The life of Master Sergeant Raul Perez Benavidez is more than history. It is a permanent, living instruction manual on the absolute upper limits of the human will. The arc of his life, from the orphaned migrant worker to the nation's highest decorated warrior, is the American promise distilled into its purest, most challenging form. He defeated the poverty that tried to claim his youth. He defeated the prejudice that tried to deny his career. He defeated the landmine that tried to cripple his body. He defeated the North Vietnamese army that tried to kill him. And he defeated the bureaucracy that tried to erase his sacrifice. Roy Benavidez's life was not a series of battles. It was a continuous, triumphant war against every force designed to keep him small, silent, and forgotten. His legacy is not just the Medal of Honor, but the profound lessons he gifted to the world. He taught us that courage is the only true currency. In the 6 hours of hell on May 2nd, 1968, he made a cold, non-negotiable choice. The life of his comrades was worth more than his own. His sacrifice was not about military strategy. It was about the moral clarity of brotherhood. The man who had been marginalized by society taught his nation the ultimate lesson in selfless loyalty. He taught us that defiance is the soul of endurance. The spit on the tarmac, the refusal to accept the crutches, the long, painful fight for a piece of missing paper. These were not acts of anger. They were acts of profound self-respect. He refused to be a victim of his wounds or the system's failures. He forced the world to meet him on his terms, alive, fighting, and demanding the truth. He taught us that the mission is always personal. Roy Benavidez did not fly into Cambodia for a political ideal. He went because his brothers were calling. He turned a military objective into an act of personal devotion, proving that the most successful soldiers are not those who are most obedient, but those who are most fiercely loyal to the men fighting beside them. Today, as we look at the immense physical legacy of his trauma, the 37 scars that map a personal war, we must recognize the final, crucial truth. Roy Benavidez was a prophet of human potential. He transformed his wounds into a message. If I, the orphaned, uneducated son of the dust, can survive this, you have no excuse to surrender to your own small struggles. He took the worst the world could offer, absorbed it, and returned it as pure, motivational power. The story of Roy Benavidez is the ultimate answer to the question of who we are as Americans. We are a nation whose greatest heroes are often found not in the halls of power, but in the trenches of injustice. We are a people whose greatest acts of love are found not in comfort, but in the chaos of shared sacrifice. The plane wreckage is gone. The enemies are gone. The cold of that day is gone. But the legend remains. It remains in the curriculum of every aspiring Green Beret. It remains in the hearts of the men he saved. It remains on the prow of the USNS Benavidez. We, the inheritors of his incredible life, have a sacred duty. We are the final muster. We are the community he spoke to in his final years. Your duty is to remember. Your duty is to be inspired. Your duty is to ensure that the ultimate American hero who fought his way out of a body bag is never forgotten again. So, here is your final mission. First, in the comments below, don't just write your state and age. Tell me, which of Roy's 37 wounds do you think carried the heaviest weight, and why? Let's honor the complexity of his sacrifice. Second, share this story with one person who you know needs to hear a message about not giving up. Third, subscribe. Keep this history alive. Master Sergeant Roy P. Benavidez has finally won his final war. He left us with the ultimate challenge. The man who spat in the face of death is counting on us to never give up on his legacy. Rest in peace, Master Sergeant. The world heard your message.